As Christian Zionism is more than a theological belief, but an imperial theology, what we are discussing, and political movement for settler colonialism, and it mutates in different parts of the world differently. You have heard this morning from Nordic region, and then now present, this panel, we have three very distinguished panelists to speak from global Christian Zionism from Canada, India, and Japan. And the first one will be speaking in this panel, Michel Andraus, and he's a native of Lebanon. He's the Dean of the Faculty of Theology at St. Paul University, Ottawa, Canada, and Professor of Intercultural Theology. The rule is same. All of you will get 10 minutes. I'll be showing, and I am very bad name about maintaining time. Thank you very much.
Hello again, good morning. It's truly an honor to be invited to be part of this conversation and to spend these few days with you, exchange ideas and what we've been thinking, doing, learning about such an important topic for our times. Being both, I'm talking about Christian Zionism and the mainline churches in Canada, while myself being a Middle Eastern or East Mediterranean Christian. So I belong to the topic in two ways. One is my origin and how my people and the whole region and our churches have been deeply affected, not only in Palestine and the creation of Israel. It impacted the whole region and shifted it significantly over the last century, and at the same time being now in an immigrant in the diaspora and having a way to look at the impact of this phenomenon of Christian Zionism and its impact on the churches in Canada, where I have been living for the last 35 years. I was supposed to come with two colleagues from Canada, and we had three topics that are related, but my colleagues with whom I work and we do research together couldn't make it, and for professional and family reasons. So I am, in a way, my topic was dependent on the panel, but I adjusted it so that I'm covering a little bit of each of the three topics to give you a sense of how are we thinking about this topic, and what are we proposing to mainline churches to move forward in this critical moment. So there's a slight modification of my title. I'm talking about challenging the mainline churches of Canada on their position regarding Palestine. A brief historical points as by way of background on some instances of early Christian Zionism in Canada, then talk about the actual challenge now to mainline churches and how are we trying to promote this agenda and moving forward in solidarity with Palestine to counteract the work of the last century in supporting the creation of the State of Israel and what came out of that for all of us. And three, I will say a few words about theological education and what are we doing in that field in relation to responding to the dominant theory of or framework of interpretation for Christian Zionism. I put two posters on the slide, on the screen, and I just got this last night. This is a conference we're organizing this coming May at my university on Palestine, Western churches, and settler colonialism. And for my fellow Arabic speakers who might, I see that typo in the Arabic title, this is only a draft, we will change it. But I will be talking about this conference in the second part of my presentation because it's directly related to the topic. There is a big gap in the scholarship on Christian Zionism in Canada. If one wants to look for sources, you really need to look for bits and pieces and multiple places. There is a lot on Zionism and on anti-Semitism and on Christian positions regarding Palestine, etc. But to actually look on, try to get a sense of the development of Christian Zionism, it's really difficult. It's still an area that requires a lot of research. So Canadian Christian Zionism, according to the few available works on the topic, started to gain supporters among Protestant and evangelical churches in the early decades of the 20th century. For obvious reasons, the influence of the 19th century British Christian Zionist movement and biblical interpretation found their way to Canada because the influence of the British Empire in relation to Canada. As of the late 19th and early 20th century, there was already Canadians involved in buying land in Palestine to help the Jews realize their return to Eretz Israel in order to facilitate the second coming of Christ. Typical Zionist theology, I won't go into that. We've heard a lot about this over the last 2 days. I selected 3 examples briefly from the early period to give you an idea about the influence of Canadian Christian Zionism during that early development. One key figure who would have significant indirect influence on the development of the Canadian position at the United Nations Special Commission on Palestine in 1947 in relation to the partition of Palestine and the birth of the Jewish state is Reverend William Lovell Hall from Winnipeg in Manitoba, an ordained missionary who moved to Palestine in 1935 after receiving a call from God during a service at the Zion Apostolic Church. William Hall spent 27 years doing missionary work in Palestine, lived in Jerusalem. According to Ron Dart, who published a short critical work on Canadian Zionism, William Hall got involved with Justice Evan Rand, influencing him, who was Canada's representative on the commission discussing the partition of Palestine, influencing Rand and his vote in the 1947 United Nations Special Committees on Palestine regarding the vote. So Rand later wrote in a foreword to a book that Hall wrote called The Fall and Rise of the Jewish People, published in 1954. This is probably the first comprehensive theology by a Canadian of the Christian Zionist thinking that's presented to the Canadian public. In his foreword to the book, Justice Rand noted the important meeting he had with Hall in Jerusalem in 1947 and acknowledged Hall's influence on his understanding of the situation in Palestine and his decision at the commission. So according to Rondard, it was Rand who turned the scales, shifted the balance at the commission in the direction of the partition. In addition, until his death in 1969, Rand became a great supporter of the Hebrew University, which created the Ivan Rand Chair of Law, and Rand became an icon in Israel, and in 1954, a forest was planted in his honor. So here the influence of one missionary on the politician who was a member of the commission, it goes a long way, who had particular views about the whole, fully informed by the whole Zionist theology. But the main foreign policy actor on the Canadian Zionist scene also according to Rondar, is Prime Minister Lester Pearson, who was Prime Minister from 1963 to 68. A peacemaking icon in Canada who was awarded the Nobel Prize in 1957, Pearson, noted Dart, has decidedly Zionist leanings, and he often made it clear that he had taken in such a position from his Christian upbringing. Pearson has been called the Lord Balfour of Canada and Rabbi Pearson, and prominent Zionists have presented him with some of their highest awards. So this is an early formative period, which I honestly didn't know much about. Christian Zionism in Canada wasn't my specialty, but I started studying and I was amazed to see how much influence these small groups had on big politicians and impacted major decisions. But moving fast forwarding to the current time, it's between 1960 and 2000, there were different governments, prime ministers with different attitudes or positions towards Israel, not all very enthusiastic. But the coming to power in Canada of Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2006 made a huge shift. He was closely connected to the Christian Zionist-based and conservative evangelicals, and made a significant turn in Canadian foreign politics vis-a-vis Israel. And in 2014, made a major visit to Israel, big speech at the parliament, talked about Israel in terms that almost one more province of Canada. And since then, there are several, free trade agreements have been in effect from the late 80s and 90s, but between 2006 and 2014, this relationship was very much strengthened, and there is a strong sense of allyship. According to Canadian political analyst and writer Yves Engler, while early Canadian Christian Zionism was spurred by British religious and imperial thinking, today's movement is heavily influenced by the social forces that support the US empire. So there is, when we look at the century, while Zionist theology had an impact in the early period and impacted both church and politics, this is shifting, I would say now, while theology is still present, but that's not really the main factor. It's one among many. The imperial alliance with the US and becoming part of the empire and the positioning of Israel in this construct all play factors in the continuation. So it's no longer that theology that's playing the key or major role. So now shift to Canadian, 10 minutes already? Oh my God. No, not 30 seconds. I need another 2 minutes. We're only 3 people. The prominent late theologian Rosemary Redford Ruther, in her article on Christian Zionism and mainline Western Christian churches in Comprehending Christian Zionism, the excellent book edited by our colleagues Robert O. Smith and Joran Gunnar, names the situation of the churches very clearly, which I believe describes well the Canadian context. There is a danger in discussing Christian Zionism as if it were only a phenomenon of a particular kind of Christian millenarian fundamentalism, and therefore a viewpoint that mainline churches can dismiss as literalist and fanatical. Equally problematic, and perhaps more important, in terms of geopolitical influence, are the more pervasive but unnamed forms of Christian Zionism found in mainline churches. These forms of Christian Zionism are deeply entwined with Western Christian imperialism toward the Middle East, represented by the British Empire and now by the American Empire. So, I need to really summarize very quickly a couple of points in the one remaining minute. So, the silence of the churches in Canada over the last 16 months has many factors to explain. It's not simply straightforward Zionist theology. It's more complex for the reasons mentioned above. However, there is only one exception, which is the United Church of Canada, that's taken a bold position in terms of calling for the ceasefire and for suspending diplomatic relations with Israel until it complies with the ICJ's opinion, as well as a complete halt on the arms trade with Israel. I am not totally hopeless, even though there is a silence, complete silence in terms of ceasefire, genocide, and what's happening, despite the strong relations and bonds between Canadian churches and the churches of Palestine and the visits and the programs. I'm not totally hopeless, and I think there is still possibility for, at this stage, for moving the churches forward in a position to push for participation in an adapted format of the BDS, and that's precisely the purpose of this conference we're doing with inviting all the heads of Canadian churches and to a conversation about this. This is not a first attempt. The churches met at our university. We've been in conversation with the leaders of the mainline churches, and this is a follow-up, primarily pushing in the direction of a commitment and a national movement towards participating in BDS and breaking the silence. If I had more time, I would talk about theology and the course that Mitri and I are planning for next fall, and this is, for me, a response to creating a different theological narrative, but I hope someone will ask me the question during the period, and I'll talk about it.
Thank you, Michelle. Sorry for that. The second panelist today, Dr. Monica Jos Namelantan, is from India and presently teaching in Australia, Melbourne. He's a church worker, theological educator, and distinguished professor of Hebrew Bible, distinguished scholar of Hebrew Bible.
Namaste and salam alaikum. I begin by echoing the many words of thanks and gratitude already expressed to His Royal Highness Ghazi bin Mohammed, Professor Mitri Raheb, Bishop Munib Yunan, and the organizing team for the opportunity to be present here and participate in this significant consultation. Unlike many of you here, I will confess that I have not really done anything that addresses directly the issue of Christian Zionism. And so it is a little daunting for me to present to this august audience of experts. This paper, therefore, is very much a work in progress, and I'm hoping that our conversation following my presentation will help me give this presentation a lot more meat. Very early in my journey into biblical studies and theological education, I made a commitment to women and to gender parity and empowerment, especially because of the plight of women in the Indian context. And if you are someone who watches the news, you would hear the stories of violence against women in India. Gender has therefore been a prominent category of analysis in my work, which is intersectional and interdisciplinary, because gender is a structural feature of social reality and must be put on the map, systematically studied, and have its symbolic and material effects incorporated into all our contemporary accounts and reflections on religion, society, and church. The gendered impacts of hostilities and war on women and girls is well known. The images and stories of the gendered experience of the conflict and displacement coming out of Gaza are horrific and rather disturbing to read and see. The UN 2024 document entitled Gender Alert, The Gendered Impact of the Crisis in Gaza, stresses that displacement exacerbates people's vulnerability, erodes their coping mechanisms, and impacts them differently based on gender. It maintains that tensions within families and communities increase the risk of gender-related protection concerns, including gender-based violence. And all of these increase. Gender relations, roles, and dynamics are impacted by loss of families in full or in part, and changes in family formation, including from predominantly nuclear and extended families to super extended families. Loss of parents to young girls, food shortages, school closures, and loss of educational opportunities lead to desperate coping mechanisms, including early marriage. Women and girls are further disadvantaged by gender inequality in access to supplies, services, and resources. With acute food shortage and insecurity levels at unprecedented levels, women and girls are hit the hardest, as women tend to vastly deprioritize their own food intake. Pregnant and lactating women are at even higher health and malnutritional risks, not only to themselves, but to their unborn babies. The crisis impacts power dynamics and gender relations, which must be considered in the delivery of humanitarian aid. So much more can be said in this regard, but you get the picture. My search for commentary on Christian Zionism from a gendered perspective came up short, and I'm unable to disassociate myself from the predicament of the Palestinian women in Gaza and wonder why the discourse on Christian Zionism has been largely silent on the question of gender and alternative sexualities. Christian Zionism is no doubt an imperial project, but it is also a patriarchal project with unique impacts on women. A vigilant observation of the functioning of Christian Zionism in India in collusion with culture makes clear the unique cultural and masculinist manifestation with important implications for the socially constructed ideas of gender. Women are constructed as carriers of honor and intergenerational reproducers of its culture, and are delineated from men through specific codes and regulations, often based on erroneous interpretations of the Bible. Women and female sexuality become gatekeepers of the moral as well as biological boundaries of the community. However, gendered constructions of women's social identities and collectivity in politics or policy discussions seldom go beyond the idealized and symbolic bearers of tradition. Such a stance bears similarities with Hindutva, an ideology that bears many affinities with Christian Zionism. Even in the literature on the correlation between these two ideological systems, in the literature, gender is rarely highlighted or even mentioned. I grieve over that fact. Hindutva begins with the belief that India has always been and should be a Hindu Rashtra or nation. It is firmly rooted in the conviction that citizens of India must accept a cultural, if not religious, Hinduism. This explicitly religious affiliation has often led leaders of the Hindutva movement to adopt fundamentalist or anti-feminist stances on women's issues. So even a cursory look at the early years of Hindutva reveals a marked emphasis within the movement on masculinity and a concomitant relegation of women to a narrow and limited role. And I'm assuming, because there's been no work done on it, that this is similar to how Christian Zionism also projects women. A traditionally masculine bastion, the movement has been subject to a quiet but significant assault on its core philosophy. Interestingly, this attack has come from within the movement in the form of a near insurgency. Women have penetrated its ranks and carved unique niches for themselves and have started focusing on creating a more inclusive agenda. But they are still products of a belief system imbued with the ideologies of patriarchy. So these women have catapulted themselves into positions of power and have changed the face of the movement, and yet their contributions are only those that would uplift and intensify and strengthen the ideology and the agenda of the Hindutva movement. Am I making sense? Yep. So while they have changed the definitions of femininity within the movement, they have also, it is also quite clear that the women come in different hues. So rather than allowing themselves to be defined by any particular notion of femininity, these women have expanded the notion, the concept of femininity to reflect their various disparate actions. And so they are resistance to be limited by a restrictive definition of femininity. But they are still agents of the movement. and so therefore, to some extent, or to a large extent, these women have been co-opted by the Hindutva movement. And so the question that I want to raise at this point is to what extent women have been co-opted by Christian Zionism. Who are these bigwigs, women bigwigs within the Christian Zionist movement who endorse and reproduce the agenda of Christian Zionism? Again, that is an area that I need to do some further reflection or research on. The radical right's homophobic, misogynist attitude has gained support among many women, leading to the hyper-normalization of the macho culture. Women are indoctrinated into perceiving themselves as weak and subordinate to their male kin, to an extent where thoughts of freedom are loathed. Women who subscribe to a Christian Zionist ideology don't observe machismo as derogatory. And this is coming from my observation of women within the church in India who are leaders of the Women's Fellowship, etc. Rather, they seek to preserve such patriarchy as a way of renewing social structure and cultural traditions, an organized form of hyper-conservative nationalism or ecclesiology that promises a golden past to its ignored, loyal, yet passionate supporters. This past or future is one where women are solely validated through their roles in the physical and social reproduction of the community they serve. Now, if you look at Google and the amount of literature that's out there, you will realize that Palestinian women themselves have also attested to the fact that patriarchy in Palestine exists, as it does elsewhere in the world, as a system that upholds male dominance and male hierarchies. And so they, in their work of what has been called resilient resistance, Palestinian women have opposed not just settler colonialism, but also Jewish Zionism, and also the Palestine patriarchal structure of the Palestinian Authority-led patriarchal political structures. So, since I'm running out of time, the question that I leave for us to ponder on is that women in Palestine and in Gaza continue to play a vital role in the resistance combating colonization, Zionism, and male supremacy. But their role has been significantly understudied. Their resilient resistance debunks the Western stereotype of passive, oppressed Arab women. And this is the counter story that needs to be publicized and incorporated into the many ways in which Zionism, Christian and Jewish, is being resisted. How might their stories and experience and resistance and what contribute or offer to our discussions here, or a theology of genocide, or a theology after Gaza? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Monica. Our third presenter, Dr. Yoshihiro Yakusige, is a Buddhist scholar at the Institute of Study of Humanities and Social Sciences, Osisisa University. His main research interests are a history of Christian Zionism and settler colonialism in Japan, politico-religious analysis of historical relations between Japan and Middle East, nuclear disarmament in the Middle East and the North.
Thank you for having me here. And it's so a big honor for me to be among these distinguished people. I talk about Christian Zionism and Israel in Japan. Christians in Japan make up less than 1% of the population, but they are relatively influential in the Japanese establishment, as is the case with the current Prime Minister Ishiba. And only a small percentage of this small community are openly committed to the doctrine of Christian Zionism. But these Christian Zionist groups are playing decisive roles to connect Japanese society and Israel. Regarding the Japan-Israel relation, it was very minor until 1980s. Generally speaking, Japanese foreign policy after the World War II has been very pro-America, but when it comes to the Middle East diplomacy, Japan had been relatively independent. During the oil crisis in 1973, Japan issued a very strong statement which supported the right to the self-determination of Palestinian people and even suggested the possibility of severing diplomatic relations with Israel. At that time, most of Japanese companies avoided the business with Israel, virtually followed the call of Arab boycott if they didn't express it openly. This attitude was partly due to Japan's extremely high dependence on the Middle East for their energy resources, but it also reflects the anti-Western sentiment which has been a latent element of Japanese nationalism. Since the Gulf War, however, Japan's Middle East policy has gradually lost its independence. This trend has become so obvious in 2014 when Japanese Prime Minister Abe and Israel Prime Minister Netanyahu issued the joint statement on the comprehensive partnership between countries. Sorry, I forgot. Yeah. And the most important Israel lobby in Japan, which promoted this process, is a Japanese Christian Zionist organization named Makuya, which means Tabernacle of Christ. They have maintained a strong partnership with the Israeli government since the 1960s, even though the group has only about 10,000 members at its peak. On the occasion of the 1967 war, its members joined the Israeli army as a volunteer soldier. In 1972, when the Japanese Red Army carried out a military operation at the Tel Aviv airport, the Makuya immediately dispatched a delegation to convey their apology directly to those who injured and the victims' families. And also they donated an ambulance to the Israeli hospital. Even during the current genocide in Gaza, they made a comforting visit to an IDF base and also organized demonstrations in support of Israel in Tokyo, in close cooperation with the Israeli embassy. Here, I'd like to present the overview of Christian Zionism in Japan. As was seen in the West or other places, there are two types of Christian Zionists, roughly speaking. First is the Christian Zionists who support Israel in doctrinal terms, such as dispensationalism. And the second is the unconscious Christian Zionists who support Israel by seeing the Jewish people as a people of the Bible and equates them with modern-day Israel state. Regarding the first category, you can divide them into two groups. One is the group which has adopted the doctrine of Christian Zionism under the direct influence of Western churches. The other group is the Christian Zionists who adopted Zionism in relation to Japanese nationalism. The Makuya can be categorized in the latter religious nationalist group. Furthermore, I think we need to expand our scope to the non-Christian Japanese Zionists. I'll talk a little bit about this later. Now, I'd like to focus on the Makuya again. They think Israel state as a fulfillment of prophecy, but are not dispensationalist. It is a group that emerged out of the non-church movement, which denied Western denominations and advocated the return to the original gospel in the time of Jesus. The non-church movement was originally advocated by Uchimura Kanzo, the first generation Protestant of modern Japan. Uchimura studied in Amherst University in 1880s, and there he had a conversion experience after deep anguishing on the contradiction between his patriotism and Christian faith. Since then, he began to believe that each nation has their own prophets who conveyed the voice of the God to their people if it was not so clear as the Hebrew Bible. Uchimura became famous for his harsh prophetic criticism against Japanese government, including its expansionist policy. But as the government's oppression on the dissidents strengthened, his thoughts gradually became more cautious and more apocalyptic, thinking that peace and justice will be achieved only by God, not through human efforts. At the time of the First World War, Uchimura finally began to advocate the Second Coming movement, in which he regarded the development of the Zionist movement was the sign of the Second Coming of Jesus. It's due to the influence of his reading of the American fundamentalist writings at the time. Thus, he became one of the first Christian Zionists in Japan. So Uchimura's Zionism was complicated, influenced from the prophetic reading of the Hebrew Bible, but at the same time from literalistic Zionist reading of it. The Makuya's founder, Ikuro Teshima, learned from one of the disciples of Uchimura and succeeded Uchimura's religious nationalist aspect with more strong emphasis on Christian Zionism. In the 1990s, Makuya became one of the core groups of the so-called historical revisionist movement. They insisted that the Asia-Pacific War was a just war for Japan to liberate Asian countries from the Western colonialism, and that Japan's post-war pacifism was a deception imposed by the Allied powers. They also advocated that Japan should recover its national pride with its military power regained. One of the leading politicians behind this movement was Shinzo Abe. His strong desire to break away from Japan's post-war pacifism was in line with the United States' interest in having Japanese armies involved in the anti-terror wars in the Middle East. One of the most important religious nationalist organizations in Japan is the Nippon Kaigi, or Japanese Council. It is mainly composed of Shinto sects that seek Japan's official support for the Yasukuni Shrine, which enshrines or commemorates the Japanese soldiers who were killed in the war, including the top war criminals who were executed after the World War II. Shintoism regards enshrined souls became a god. So the governmental support for Yasukuni Shrine could mean the reversal of the very basic premise of Japanese post-war diplomacy, that it accepts the defeat of the war and will not revive its imperial cult by observing the principle of separation of the religion and the state. In 2014, when the Prime Minister Abe was seeking to strengthen the ties with Israel, the famous right-winger Hideaki Kase, who the left side person, Kase is the senior member of the Nippon Kaigi and a friend of Abe, said as follows: Prime Minister Abe shouldn't hesitate to make an official visit of Yasukuni Shrine by doing what Japan should do without worrying about American intentions, possibly open up. Japan should follow Israel's behavior. Israel is irritating America by building settlements one after another on the West Bank, but because it repeated it so frequently and continued to ignore the American criticism against it, the American government and media have become accustomed to it. Just as the US cannot formulate a Middle East policy without Israel, it is impossible for them to think about Asian policy without Japan. So if Japan follows the path it wants to proceed and behavior in a Japanese manner, the US will finally become to respect Japan like Israel. At this time, the Kase was an advisor to the Japan-Israel Friendship Society. This organization is operated by Israeli Embassy in cooperation with Makuya. Kase's writing will express the divisive character of Japanese nationalism, which accompanies both repulsion against and longing for the Euro-American centrism. The Japanese right-wingers think that Japan should reflect on its wars of aggression and colonial rules of neighboring nations, because the America and other allied powers have never reflected on their colonial past, according to them. For them, the only way to confirm their national pride is to go up the imperialist post-war order by humiliating neighboring countries. And to achieve this, it is necessary to be in the side of the United States. Thus, Japanese chauvinism towards Asian neighbors becomes a political tool for the aims of utilization of Japanese military for the United States military strategy. The imperialist use of...
30 seconds.
Okay. Sorry. The imperialist use of such regional rivalries and chauvinism can be seen so universally in human history. This is exactly in line with the history of the emergence of Zionism in Europe. So I believe that overcoming Christian Zionism is directly related to the challenge of liberating ourselves from this kind of opportunist and unjust identity politics that is based on the nation-state system. What is important will be alternative recognition and construction of intersectional subjectivities, as many speakers in this conference are already advocating and practicing. Thank you so much.